Welcome to Read. Nathan Furr is professor of strategy at INSEAD, and together with his wife Susannah, who is an entrepreneur, they've written a book that offers a science-backed guide for navigating and thriving through uncertainty. It's called The Upside of Uncertainty, a guide to finding possibility in the unknown. Nathan and Susannah, welcome to Read.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Let me start by asking about your different approaches to this whole area of uncertainty. Who's a natural at it? Who's not? Who had to be, taught about or tutored along the way? Whose idea was it to get this book going? And how do your different approaches to uncertainty inform the book?
Yeah, well, so I've been studying innovators for 20 plus years, interviewing them. And I was just fascinated because I could very clearly see that to do anything new, all the new things we admire about that they do, the new products, new businesses, new social changes, whatever it may be, to get to that, they always had to go through uncertainty. And I wanted the new things, but I struggle with uncertainty. It frightens me. And so I was like, what could I learn from them that would help me do this better? Because I'd seen also in my own life, like changes we had made that, after stepping into the unknown that I really loved, but I always struggled with making that first step. And by contrast, I think.
Yeah, so I would just say that for whatever reason, I do love getting on the frontier. That's one of our tools. And really just I've realized quite young, when we do team up with the unknown, we get to really cool things, to exciting things, to change that's worthwhile. It still has risks. It has even heartache sometimes, but it really is where we can have amazing breakthroughs.
Who is this book for?
Well, my background is I'm a business school professor, so I'm a professor at INSEAD. So naturally, most of my work has been for organizations and managers, but this is different. This is really for individuals, for everybody, because what we realized in writing is that like everybody faces uncertainty, every single person, and all of us could create better lives, better teams, better organizations, but it starts with the person. It starts with us getting comfortable with uncertainty, and then we can lead it if we're in a leadership role, or we can create an organization that has greater uncertainty ability, but we have to start building our own muscles to be comfortable in uncertainty.
All right, let's start with some definitions. What is uncertainty ability? What does that refer to?
So uncertainty ability is this like a muscle. We believe it's a strength that you get by practicing it. So it's someone who has seen that there is a possibility on the other side of the unknown and who is willing to take the small steps, start practicing and experimenting with doing things that you're not comfortable with, and that you can get better at it. So it's someone who has actually increased their ability to navigate and face uncertainty.
And it's everybody who's gone through the pandemic, for example, has built some of that. You may not feel like it, you may feel stressed out, but the good news is you started building that muscle. And so how do you continue building that muscle as you go through your life? Because what you find when we interviewed innovators is you get comfortable taking more risks and bigger risks. And that may sound like, oh, I don't want to do that. But if you look at the end of people's lives, what do they regret? They always regret the same things: not spending more time with the people they love and not taking more risks.
And actually, I would love to just talk about the pandemic as an example, because if you think about it, now that we all did it, not that we would want to go through that again, but we would know, like, oh yeah, they can close boundaries and frontiers of countries. They can make us wear masks. They can make us do all these things. It's helpful to think, oh yeah, if I heard the word pandemic again, I would know in my mind exactly what that's going to look like. And so we all now have an ability of going through that because we've done it. Not that we would want to, but we've strengthened that ability to know what that would feel like. It would be way less uncertain for us.
And do you think journeying as an entrepreneur, Susannah, has upped your uncertainty ability to some extent?
Yeah, I definitely do. I think what was so wonderful for me is before I started it was a clothing line, was really my first, foray into the entrepreneurial world. But at first I thought I was going to do more of a cottage industry thing, making small things myself and selling them. And when I got to the Bay Area, Nathan was doing his PhD at Stanford. Within about 2 weeks, being around all that entrepreneurial action, I said, it was in the air, it was in the water. I immediately knew, no, I'm going to team up with wonderful people, with a company that can make these things for me. I'm going to get a pattern maker. And it was just like, it launched my ability to see what was possible because I was in a surrounding where it was normal. And so I do think as you are around people and as you yourself believe that you can do something, then it does help you because you swiftly are in now the unknown and you're on the frontier and you're passing it and saying, I did it. So I do think that that definitely impacts your experience with uncertainty.
I love that. Nathan, you're professor of strategy at INSEAD, as you mentioned. And before we get into some of the concepts that you bring up in this book, I'd like to ask, what from your own life do you share in this book?
So actually, we talk all about how we have had to step into the unknown to make many of the big changes in our lives. So I've changed careers many times. I've changed topics. I've changed, geographies. So we obviously you can hear from our accents that even though I'm a professor at INSEAD in France and also in Singapore, that I'm originally from the West Coast of the U.S. And so we became expats and we've made many other big changes that we talk about, including setbacks. There are some serious setbacks. I mean, we started this book long before the pandemic, a decade before. But when the pandemic hit, all of my income comes from teaching and speaking. Like that disappeared in a week. And I was freaking out. We have kids in school. We have tuitions to pay. We've got mortgage to pay. And Susannah said to me in that moment, she said, if you can't apply these tools to help yourself, you don't get to write this book. And so we talk about in the book also some of those little anxieties we all face, like, will I lose my job? Can I pay the mortgage? Can I, what's going to happen? And what's the worst thing that could happen? I'm worried about it. And so we weave in those personal stories along with the stories of, innovators and creators and designers and other groups as well, paramedics.
You mentioned being an expat, and I think there's a line in this book that talks about how being an expatriate opens you up to the notion that so much of life is what we invent. I wonder if you can elaborate a little bit on how being an expat has maybe brought you up close to this whole concept of uncertainty.
One thing we do love is that when you move to a foreign place, at first everything feels strange and you don't know how much of it you need to like learn and replicate and so that you fit in and so that people aren't looking at you all the time like a freak. But ultimately, our favorite thing about expat life is that you get to be in this middle zone where you take the things you love and you bring the things from your culture that you don't want to give up on. And you ultimately end up being in this place. I know they call it like third culture kids, are children who may have parents from different cultures and they're being raised in a different country, maybe even than they were born. And this beautiful mixture of getting to really decide for yourself what about what you were raised in you love, and then let go of the things you don't, and then taking in from the new culture. And I would suggest that people who aren't expats could still do this by even learning of different cultures and learning about maybe ancestors that live somewhere else, or meeting your neighbors and seeing how they do things and say, I love that. I want to add that in,
Yeah, it really brings home in a visceral, tangible way what the very famous innovator Steve Jobs said, which allowed him to kind of be so innovative. And that is, it's all made up. It's all made up. And that's what happens when you go live in another culture. You think all these things that you kind of these assumptions that you were operating on as if they were true, you realize, wait, this other culture doesn't believe that at all. Wait, all of this is made up. So what do I want to choose? What are the rules I want to create for myself that I want to live by rather than somebody else has made?
Yeah, an example of that would be just in France, how they take vacation. August is like closed down. And when we arrived, we had planned our moving truck to arrive perfectly. So we had 1 week before Nathan would show up at INSEAD, and the whole thing got bungled. The moving truck was late. And when he called the university to say, oh, I'm not going to be there, they're like, it's all locked down. Like no one's here. And we just couldn't believe it was true. And now 7 years later, we're so used to it. Everything's shut down because these people decided we are going to take a big chunk of time and just be off grid and get out of here. And it's wonderful.
And I think what's great about your book is, even if you haven't ever been an expat and experience what it's like to move to a different country and find almost that you can reinvent yourself because nobody really knows your background, where you're from, what you were brought up with, your values. Your book challenges you to, I suppose, expand your boundaries no matter where you are. You don't necessarily have to be at the end of a long-haul flight to be able to do that. And I thought that was interesting. Can you talk a little bit about some of the tools in your book, Reframe, Prime, Do, Sustain? Let's start with Reframe. How Is this different from look on the bright side of life, looking on the bright side?
Yeah. So what you just named. So in the upside of uncertainty, we identify over 30 tools that we saw these innovators using to step into the unknown with courage. That's a lot. So how do you remember that? So you've just named these 4 categories. So we categorize them. And so what is reframing really about? It is really about this. It's based on this very well proven psychological mechanism, which is called framing. That's the way you describe something shapes how you think, decide, and act. And that's a very powerful thing. And so if you describe something in terms of the uncertainty, you're going to invoke a lot of fear and a lot of resistance. If you describe something in terms of the possibility, you're actually going to create energy and excitement. And we see this in like, psychological studies all the way up to organizations who frame a threat as the opportunity. Instead, they're actually much more effective. So that's the basic idea, but how do you do that? So the tools are about how you do that. So one of the tools in the reframing section is called frontiers. And it's acknowledging that although what's a frontier? It's like the boundary of what we're comfortable with, the edge of what we know. And the truth is most of us, because we're a little afraid of the frontier, live far back from the frontier. We stay really comfortable. And so the idea of frontiers, that tool is what innovators see differently is they see the frontier not as a scary place, but as the place they're going to do their very best work, where they're going to have inspiration and breakthrough and insight. And so what they do is they say, instead of living far back from the frontier, how do I step into it? How do I get onto that? And think about your own life. There's frontier of relationship, there's frontier of intellectual, career, physical. We could go on and on. And so the challenge is, how could you, if you're feeling bored, if you're feeling burnt out, it might be, I need to step on the frontier of relationship with somebody, or in my career, or on intellectual. And guess what? Organizations have frontiers too. They have frontiers of customer and employees and product and thought leadership. And they too sometimes need to get onto the frontier. And we were just reading about Bob Dylan, who won the Nobel Prize in Literature. Crazy, right? And he's such a weird, strange character who has this kind of funny voice. But what's interesting is he really credits the breakthrough in his career with getting on the frontier. And what he said is, everybody was writing short songs. I wanted to break out of that. So I started reading long poems and trying to remember as much as I could about it. And that really pulled him out into the unique space that he created of these long, social and political oriented songs that or that really shook people's emotions up, that really made him distinctive. So again, frontiers is one of many tools to reframe uncertainty, reframe what scares us, so that we can go into it with more courage and more optimism.
I would love to just add. Can I just add, with
Go ahead.
reframing, different than just the bright side of things? I mean, I think sometimes when people just say, oh, cheer up and rose-colored glasses, the difference with reframe is, like Nathan just said, there's more courage attached. It's not just kind of ignoring the reality. It's really recognizing this is going to feel scary. There are some dangers out there. Some stuff's not going to work. But with this courageous excitement, kind of what's hovering nearby that I could do that actually is going to help me a lot, even if it challenges me, even if we don't grow with some struggle. It's like no mud, no lotus of Thich Nhat Hanh. We have to have some rub, some friction to get to our best work. It's on the frontier.
Can you share some examples about how people do cope with those scary feelings or those negative feelings, should they, be on the frontier or try to live from the frontier?
Yeah, in the prime section, we actually talk about how you really are going to need to create an arsenal. That's probably a bad analogy of weapons, but you need to have uncertainty balancers. You need to have comforts and routines and rituals that you can count on that bring down the temperature of that uncertainty that you're feeling. But that touches into the sustain arm of tools as well, because when things do go wrong, there are practices we can do that help us feel better about the situation. Maybe we've figured out that something we really hoped for and dreamed for is not going to happen or is not going to work. The sustain category of tools helps us recenter, going back to that original framing of that the possibility is still worth trying for. There's also emotional hygiene. So really letting us feel and become aware of how much maybe grief or sorrow there is in this current situation. But how do we keep enduring through it and waiting for that possibility to show up? We might need to rely on some frustration management frames. There's a gratitude frame where you think about what you still have.
Yeah, I mean, maybe a good example of that, just to illustrate, I told you that I struggle with this, and the pandemic presented a particularly sharp struggle for me. So in this time when Susannah's like, if you can't use these tools to help yourself, you don't get to write this book. I remember waking up very early one morning with my mind really just on fire with anxiety about what's going to happen. Am I going to be able to make ends meet? And going downstairs, and I was just kind of robotically going through the motions when uh, I remembered this tool in the sustain section, which is the gratitude frame. So what you focus on the uncertainty is not what I could lose, but what do I still have? And at that moment, I had this like sudden, like it was almost like my senses awoke, and I realized I was in the middle of grinding these coffee beans, and these beans smelled so rich and earthy. It's really a lovely smell when you stop and think about it. And then I was in the kitchen, and I noticed that the sunlight was, streaming in through this window, and it was really so beautiful, this morning light. And it was at that moment I thought, wait, I will, as long as I'm alive, always have this. I could lose it all. I could lose the job. I could go bankrupt, lose the apartment, the whole thing. And I would still have the chance to have coffee in the morning. I would still have sunlight. And then the real kicker was, and if I'm lucky, I'll have the relationships with the people I love. You know what? If I go bankrupt, it's not going to be that bad because I'll still have so much. And like the anxiety like fell off my shoulders. And so that's what we mean by kind of sustain yourself. And that's the opposite, by the way, of what most of us do is we beat ourselves up. We say, oh, I'm such an idiot to take that risk. I'd flip it and say, how courageous of you to take that risk, because you might regret never having tried.
So interesting. I wonder if you can unpack for us one of your tools under the category Prime. What does that refer to?
So priming is this idea that you can prepare in advance for uncertainty. So remember, we talked about these four arms or these four categories. We actually organize them around this first aid cross for uncertainty. And reframing and sustaining, as you can tell, are a little bit more thinking oriented. And priming and doing are a little more action oriented. So what actions could we take in advance to be ready? And one of my favorites was taught to me by one of my mentors at Stanford, Dr. Tina Seelig. And, Susannah told about being in Silicon Valley. The heroes are the entrepreneurs, not nerdy professors like me. And so I was really beating myself up saying, I wish I had the courage to go out and be an entrepreneur, but I'm not a risk taker. And Tina just stopped me. She said, what do you mean you're not a risk taker? I said, yeah, I just don't have the courage to risk it all. And she said, well, do you really think there's only one kind of risk? And she said, in my mind, there's financial risk, there's social risk, there's intellectual risk, there's physical risk. We could go on. And she said, okay, so you have one income. So Susannah was starting her clothing line at that time. So it was just my PhD student stipend, which is really tiny. We were going into debt. We had 4 kids living in this tiny, tiny, tiny apartment. She said, so you want to take a financial risk right now? That makes sense to me. But you seem like somebody who's willing to take an intellectual and social risk. And what she was trying to teach me is this really important lesson. Number one, we all have natural affinities and aversions. It's important to understand those so we can play to our strengths. So for me, it was intellectual and social risks. And so we can recognize where we're going to feel vulnerable. And for me, it was financial risk. So we can fortify a bit so that we can take action. But the second principle is that just because we have a natural set of things we come with doesn't mean those things are fixed. And we want to be careful that we don't miss out on the things that are most important to us or that we care most about, because we can be creative. So one entrepreneur we interviewed, he's done 8 startups, but he hates financial risk. So how do you match those up? How do you fortify your financial risk and do 8 startups? Well, he's set up his life so that he always has something on the side paying the bills while he goes and he does his startup. And the way to expand your risk tolerances is to take little risks. So, I have financial risk aversion, but I can start taking little financial risks, see how that goes, and then that gives me more comfort in taking bigger risks. And so think about your own life and do a little assessment. And by the way, organizations can do this as well. We've done it with organizations. The labels are different, but it's really about taking stock and then saying, where do I need to strengthen and where do I need to play to my affinities?
The book says it's a science-backed guide for navigating through uncertainty. Help us understand the science behind it.
Well, here's the interesting thing. So when I first wanted to dig into this question, I went out and I looked at the literature that was available. So there's literatures on fields like such as uncertainty avoidance and ambiguity tolerance and resilience, all of which highlight it's possible to learn this, but didn't give us very much about how. So that was the puzzle, right? So I want to be very clear. There are parts of this book which are drawn from a body of empirical research. So, for example, in the fields of entrepreneurship and innovation, that feeds very deeply into the do section, or in psychology, which feels very deeply into the sustain section. But a lot of it was missing. So we went out and did interviews with, scientists, including Nobel Prize winning scientists, CEOs, entrepreneurs, innovators, designers, creators, paramedics, gamblers, surfers, like everybody who faces uncertainty. And that's a form of qualitative research. And then, even with that said, though, there were situations where there just wasn't anything at all. And so we had to use a little bit of theory building. So it's really a mix of kind of typical empirical research, interview, or what we'll call qualitative research, and then kind of some theory building. But we try to gather evidence in a careful way and in all circumstances.
Can you share some examples of entrepreneurs in this book that we will encounter who really exemplify a lot of these principles?
I think the biggest one is going to be David Heinemeier Hansen from Denmark. He's done lots of startups, including Ruby on Rails and Basecamp and Pay.com, which is an email platform.
If you use an app, you probably are using something built on his stuff. So,
but he kind of nailed so many of these different categories. He really has a beautiful way of being an entrepreneur. He does not believe in the idea that you have to sleep under your desk and work 100-hour weeks. In fact, in his startups and in his company culture, he really works with what he calls values instead of goals. He doesn't believe that a startup should set out to just make 10x millions of dollars. He says that's really out of our control. But if we work according to values, then we will be able to, we can't fail. Actually, he's really quite a fun, pushes on the boundaries of what people usually think is possible for a startup. He gives his people 4-day work weeks during the summer. He wants people to really feel like they matter and that they're human. So his 3 values that he works from are writing really good software, giving his company, just really treating his employees well, and then acting ethically in the marketplace. But he again, Nathan mentioned him. He was the one who he hates financial risk. So how does he do this in other ways? And he also sustains himself. He talked about when he launches something, how it is really stressful because he doesn't know if it's going to work or not. But he talked about how, he really goes back to kind of these stoicism of ideals of memento mori, even, where realizing so much is out of my control. How do I want to live today? So he sustains himself through the times when it's not certain whether his project is going to thrive or survive even.
This is a great book. It's so inspirational, but it's also amazing that it was written by a husband and wife team. I think you're the first husband and wife team that we've had on this show. I know your first book was about zombies, but can you tell us a little bit about collaborating on this one? And what's key to, making sure this dance, 2 of you from different backgrounds, obviously different styles of writing, I assume. What is key to working collaboratively as authors?
By the way, you mentioned the zombies. That's how we met. 30 years ago in university. We've been married 25 years, and it was a research project. And it's kind of a tale of curiosity because long before I met Susannah, I would just wander around the library and try to find interesting things. And I found this pseudoscientific study of a witch doctor, thing. So the scientists went to Haiti and tried to understand, is there an explanation for this phenomenon, zombies? And so, years later, I'm in class and, the instructor's like, let's write research projects. Let's suggest some topics. And people are throwing out like vegetarianism and euthanasia. I'm like, that's so boring. Let's do something interesting. And so I throw out zombies. Susannah joins the project, and we have fun from there. But I think there's, obviously an intellectual foundation there from that project. But I mean,
I would love to
there.
say, just from this morning, we were filming an asynchronous course so that people can do these tools and really learn about them on their own time. And here's the brilliant thing about our relationship is Nathan, in fact, these are even our little totem animals. I don't know if anyone knows theirs, but Nathan is the woodpecker and I'm the snow goose. So Nathan he needs to get into the precision. He is this academic expert. He wants to make sure we've completely, clearly, and perfectly detailed exactly what's happening. It's the scientist academic part. And the snow goose kind of goes flying way high and sees the big picture and sees all these little threads that they want, like we could do this or we could do this. And sometimes that is a collision because I'm wanting to fly high and he's wanting to detail. But ultimately, the book is a compilation of both methods coming together, I think, to make sure we're explaining it clearly and well and not just being too abstract, but also bringing in tons of different threads so that we can, some things will work for some people, some stories won't. And my hope is that the people who want these business examples with all that rigor and diligence will hear that, but also in a new way, in kind of in some different, more abstract scenarios.
Yeah, I think the secret is, if I put it in a word, is complementarity. It's that we rarely realize how valuable somebody with a different perspective is. But at the heart of innovation, it's really about recombining ideas. And so I think for us, the key was, we're different. How do we value that difference and make the most out of that difference? And I think that's really the combination there. Snow goose and woodpecker, inside of the business innovation world versus in the entrepreneurial creative world. So it's the coming together.
I think that's why this is unlike any other book by an INSEAD professor that I have picked up. No other book has a snow goose perspective, I think. You mentioned a course. Is that available to the general reader?
Yeah, so we have a website with the same title as the book, The Upside of Uncertainty. There's a second website that's called uncertaintypossibility.com. Again, uncertainty, possibility are two sides of the same coin. That's how you remember. But that course is going to be available to everybody because we all learn differently. And it gives us a chance to engage with people, to tell richer stories, to riff off of things. And so that's going to be on the website. And also, by the way, some people are resource constrained. The tools, we describe them all on the website as well. So we want to just get these into people's hands so they can kind of reinvent their own lives.
We actually envision a community too, and adding tools, because the story is not over with uncertainty. We are just all ratcheting up. Every day we're being asked to be under more and more and more uncertainty in this world right now. So we envision interviewing new people and coming up with new tools. So that will be a community piece as well.
I was just going to say, here on Money FM, we're a business station, and almost every day we talk about the theme of reinvention because it's so important to all the entrepreneurs that we're speaking with. So, I can see how the course and your websites can expand on this in a great way. So I wish you all the best. It's a great read. Thank you so much for joining us, Nathan Furr and Susannah Furr. They're both co-authors. The book is The Upside of Uncertainty, a guide to finding possibility in the unknown. I'm Michelle Martin. Readers, keep reading.
Money FM 89.3